Alright, I have a feeling that this episode is one that's going to be shorter, but we'll see where it goes. Anyway, with another key episode down, I'm a little sad that the episode played out the way that it did. I mean, after all, the materials are all here for an excellent Applejack Key episode. We have the Flimflam brothers, which are practically the best villains, at least I believe, for an Applejack Key episode. The episode focuses on how Applejack would act when honesty would hurt her family's feelings. I know that the last roundup deals with this as well, but we'll get into that later. The only problem was the outlier, the thing that would make or break the episode, and that was the writer.
As we said in a previous video, Josh Haber's 2 episodes, Castlemania and Simple Ways, were both polarizing in their own right. Vicodin remembered liking both episodes, and we'll reserve our opinions on those until later, but when it comes to this episode, let's discuss the opener. The introduction of Granny Smith being a diving champion was definitely interesting. I love the idea that Granny Smith is that grandparent who did a bunch of awesome stuff when she was young and is now chilling with all her stories and folklore. We did have a few problems with the opener, such as the random Big Mac shark, which just felt like a forced joke to end the opener that was placed onto a character that wouldn't even have this sort of shark cap to begin with. Big Mac does seem like someone who would crack jokes, but this seems more like something Pinky would do.
Another problem we had is what we get from Granny's story about her diving issues. Apparently, Granny can't swim because of a combination of an injury and her overall fear of the water. This, we can understand. There hasn't been a previous scene that refuted this story, and it correlates with her bad hip, something that was brought up way back during the Ticketmaster. Golden rule number 1 of story-based animation: continuity that isn't forced is usually awesome. The problem with this story isn't something that bothers us so far, but it does have a connection later on down the line. Overall, the opener was good, minus the last 3 lines. Although some could say the opener was boring, and we could see that if Granny's story wasn't really engaging to the viewer.
The first act is when things definitely start to pick up. The Flim Flam Brothers song was excellent, definitely on par with the Cider Squeezy, and the voice actors for Flim and Flam knock it out of the park once more. Considering nearly the entire act is composed of the song, and the song is pretty long, there really isn't much we have to say about it, except for Silvershill, whose contribution to the Flim and Flam act begins to make the episode feel like a formulaic plot that it is. Granted, we don't know about this until almost halfway through the episode, but the Flim Flam brothers picking a volunteer instead of asking for one definitely brings up a red flag for those who have seen this story before. You could have masked it a little by having the Flim Flam brothers ask for volunteers and then choose Silvershill, but that also brings up a red flag for some since a lot of magicians do that as well.
Act 2 is when things start to fall apart a little bit for us, and it begins with Apple Bloom and Applejack's discussion about the tonic. Here's where I sort of got confused.
When some pony says something's too good to be true, it usually is.
You mean Granny wasted her money?
Well, I don't know about that, but I don't think there's a tonic in Equestria that can make an old pony young again.
I thought that this wasn't the point of the tonic. I know the tonic's fake, but the point of the tonic, at least with what it's showing, is that it's a cure-all tonic. The point where I get confused is that within the episode and the spoilers, the tonic's use was focused on making Granny Smith younger so that she could swim. But previously, the consequences that went behind her hesitance to swim was, at least conveyed in the opener, her injury. So, according to the episode, the tonic cured her old age. But the old age isn't the problem. Her ghost pain is the problem. Now, you could argue that the placebo effect is at play during this episode, but the problem is that I say argue because it isn't really obvious. The placebo effect is applying towards Granny's apparent ghost pain, but we aren't aware of that until the end of the episode. So those who are aware of this sort of effect are kind of confused, like I was, because the show characters are claiming that the fake tonic is fixing something that isn't actually contributing to Granny's ability to swim. They say that Granny is acting younger, but if Granny is injured like she says in the opener, then being supposedly younger wouldn't really matter when it comes to her injury. Unless she was supposedly so young due to the tonic that the injury never happened to her. But that's just dumb, both in theory and what's conveyed.
I think it's more along the lines that the phrase Granny is acting younger because the tonic is just a catch-all phrase for injuries going away and her being able to swim better. At the very least, the wording is confusing. The entire Apple family going to save Granny Smith in the lake was kind of silly as well, since it didn't look at all like she was drowning. She was doing the breaststroke, backstroke, and wasn't making any sort of gurgling or panic noises. She was completely calm, but we'll go with it. Granny Smith possibly wearing herself out due to her newfound stamina is a good side problem for this story, considering it's completely realistic to us. Once the Apple sisters find Silvershill faking it and Applejack confronts Flim and Flam, the discussion was well conveyed. Even though there's only one other episode with these characters and their characterization changed, them bouncing off each other's words and practically acting just as in tune off stage as on stage makes them feel awesome, like they've been the conning sales ponies they show to be their entire lives.
Although this choice of characterization is different in this episode compared to Cider Squeezy. For example, in the previous episode, the brothers actually had a product that worked fairly well and would have been able to make more cider than the Apple family if the main six didn't join the competition and their ego didn't get the best of them. In this episode, the ego gets the best of them again, but in a completely different way. They didn't put their trust behind their product this time around, but behind their ability to persuade Applejack by using her family against her, which may not be as physically manipulative and quote-unquote evil such as trying to take over Sweet Apple Acres, but is mentally manipulative, which you could argue is more evil since this kind of challenge to Applejack's very foundation of her element could break her mind and possibly the Apple family along with Applejack's reputation. So instead of threatening what the Apples owned, Flim and Flam threatened what the Apples believed in, and I believe that's clever and evil in its own way. So when it comes to those who believe that Flim and Flam were out of character or think that he was written differently, it kinda depends on who you think Flim and Flam are. We think they are con artists who will do anything for money, which is what appears to be with both this episode and their desperation to take over the cider business by running the Apple family out of their farm. So the characterization remains the same to us, it's just simply two different business practices.
The scene afterwards works well in the Applejack problem, even though it's just basically filler for what is eventually the act that will bring Applejack over the edge. Combining with the problem created by the next Flim Flam visit by Applejack giving her stamp of approval for the tonic, the obvious moral of honesty is the best policy begins to show. I mean, arguably all the scenes work well despite the few things we pointed out from beginning to end. But that's because this episode is so textbook and formulaic that the alignment of the scenes and acts can't really be wrong. The episode in general is hard to analyze considering it's basically a blown up version of the snake oil salesman trope thrown into an episode that feels familiar and worse. The Applejack struggling with a lie was done before and better in the last roundup, so it feels like we're treading old ground on that moral.
While Flim and Flam were written perfectly, nearly every second with the Apple family was boring considering their scenes were either filler for the end or written as textbook as their format. Not to mention the lack of subtlety due to Applejack's conversation with Silvershell during Act 3 since the moral was literally the opposite of his honesty isn't the best policy sometimes line. And the problem with that is that Silvershell's moral practically applies to Applejack throughout most of the time within the show. One such example is her lying about the construction within the barn during Party of One. Honesty is the best policy, but apparently not when you don't want to spoil a surprise for your friend. The same can be said for everything that she hasn't said, and while not saying anything isn't technically being dishonest, that's practically splitting hairs if you're able to be honest, but simply aren't due to whichever reasons, the example again being the last roundup.
Peggy, I did not break my promise.
What?
If y'all reckon back, I told you that I would tell you everything at breakfast. But I didn't come to breakfast. I couldn't come to that breakfast. Not if it meant telling y'all what happened.
Ring any bells? We're aware of what the episode is trying to do. They want to emulate most of the key episodes by challenging the characters' morals that were built up by their ailments in life. The only problem is that again, more than half of this episode is ridiculously boring. Nearly the entire thing is able to be figured out the moment the tonic is introduced, and the already used lesson that is construed from this episode is conveyed poorly. It technically applies to Applejack, but the line of "it's painful to believe a lie even more" just stinks of either hypocrisy because the lesson finally applied when it inconvenienced her, or the feeling of duh of the subtext behind a lot of the previous episodes already told us this. She believed the lie of the vampire fruit bats being pests. She believed the lie that the buffalo didn't deserve a stampeding ground. She believed the rationalization that Twilight was fine in Lesson 0. The list goes on. Also, we find it kind of silly that a bit is Applejack's supposed spoiler key thingy. Just seems odd, and it could be something that means a lot more of a story, like Silvershell's crutch, or a bottle of the tonic, or even better, one of the apples that the tonic was made with.
Lyra was fun in this episode. I think that was pretty obvious. I personally enjoy when familiar background ponies are put into roles like that, much like how Dr. Hoops was the timekeeper in Super Speedy Cider Squeezy, and so on. Also, as far as we know, doesn't it look like the Flim Flam brothers won in this scenario? They scammed loads of money off of the ponies within Ponyville despite their previous reputation, and they even scammed the money off of their rivals, the Apple family, considering the huge bag of coins that Granny Smith dropped during Act 2. There was no implication that the Flim Flam brothers gave the money back, so they actually got away with what they did. That's kind of a sucky thing to portray to little kids. Caveat emptor, my children. Everyone's out to get your money and the bad guys win. Sometimes. Although that last part is true, debatably.
Well, that's all we got for this episode. So, it's true. We were a lot shorter than the last time around. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy our videos, and support us on Patreon if you want to keep us going, along with some awesome reward tiers on the side. We're planning on releasing our first Q&A video tomorrow, but we still love questions if you have any. Last but not least, thank you for watching and have a great day.